Okay. Hello, Weekly Marx, 26th of January. Princeton edition, 2024, Volume 1, Capital. Karl Marx. Constant capital and variable capital. The different components of the labor process play different roles in creating a product's value. A worker adds new value to the object of his labor by applying a certain amount of labor to that object, whatever the specific content, purpose, or technical character of his labor may be. The value of the used up means of production simply reappears as part of the new product's value. For example, the cotton's value and the spindle's value reappear in the yarn value. The value of the means of production is transferred to the product and thereby preserved in it. This transfer takes place as the means of production are being turned into the product. In other words, during the labor process. It is mediated by labor. How so? A worker doesn't work twice, first to give the cotton new value by applying his labor to it, and then again to preserve the cotton's old value, i.e., transfer to the yarn the value of the cotton he works on and the value of the spindle he works with. Rather, he preserves the old value simply by adding new value. Adding new value to an object of labor and preserving the old value there are two very different things. Yet a worker does both at the same time in a single act of labor. Clearly, then, only the twofold character of his labor can account for this twofold result. His labor must operate in two capacities at once, in one capacity creating value, in the other capacity preserving or transferring it. Now, how does a worker add labor time and thus value? Only by performing a specific type of productive labor. A spinner adds labor time by spinning, a weaver by weaving, a smith by forging, and so on. However, when workers add labor as such, and therefore new value in the specific forms of spinning, weaving, and forging, they transform the means of production, that is, cotton, spindles, yarn, looms, iron, and anvils, into the elements that constitute a new use value or product. The old forms of these use values wear away, but only to be incorporated into new forms of use value. In examining the process of creating value, we saw that insofar as the use value is consumed in order to produce a new use value, the labor time needed to produce the old use value being employed makes up part of the labor time required to produce the new one. That labor time is transferred from the means of production being consumed to the new product. Hence, it isn't by adding labor as such that a worker preserves the value of a used up means of production or transfers its value to a new product as an element of the new product's value. Rather, what enables him to preserve the value of the means of production is the particular useful character of his labor, the specific productive form of the labor he adds. In this form, or as a purposeful productive activity as spinning, weaving, or forging, labor needs only to touch the means of production in order to raise those means from the dead. This labor animates the means of production, turning them into factors of the labor process and combining with them to become new products. If a spinner changed jobs, he would no longer be making yarn from cotton and thus wouldn't be transferring the cotton's value and the spindle's value to the yarn. On the other hand, if he became a carpenter, a day of his labor would still add value to his material as before. His labor adds value not because it has the particular form spinning or carpentry, but rather insofar as it is abstract social labor as such, and his labor adds a particular magnitude of value not because it has a particular useful content, but because it is performed for a certain amount of time. It is in its abstract general capacity, or as an expenditure of human labor power, that the spinner's labor adds new value to the cotton's value and the spindle's value. and it is in its capacity as concrete, particular, useful labor, in other words, as spinning, that his labor transfers the value of the means of production to the product, preserving that value in it. Thus, labor performed just once yields a double-sided result. Simply adding a quantity of labor adds new value, whereas the quantity of the added labor is what preserves the old value of the means of production in the product. The double-sided effect that arises from labor's double-sided character becomes palpable in an array of phenomena. Suppose that, thanks to some new invention, a spinner can spin as much cotton in 6 hours as he used to spin in 36 hours. The power of his labor as a purposeful, useful, productive activity has increased sixfold. Its product is 6 times greater than it was. It's 36 pounds of yarn instead of 6 pounds. But now 36 pounds of cotton absorb only as much labor as 6 pounds used to. Only a sixth of the previous amount of new labor is absorbed by each pound of cotton due to the new method. And so the amount of new value added to each pound is only 1/6 of its former magnitude. However, the product, 36 pounds of yarn, now receives 6 times as much old value from the cotton as before. 6 times as much old value coming from the raw material is preserved in or transferred to the product during the 6 hours of spinning, while only 1/6 as much new value is added to the same raw material. This shows how labor preserves old value excuse me, preserves old value in a fundamentally different capacity from how it creates new value, even though the labor is being performed in a single, indivisible process. The more necessary labor time that is added to a given quantity of cotton during the spinning process, the greater the amount of new value added will be. The more cotton that is spun in a given amount of labor time, the greater amount of old value preserved in the product will be. Now, imagine the opposite scenario. God, the spinner's productivity remains constant. It takes as much time as before to turn a pound of cotton into yarn. However, the exchange value of the cotton varies. The price of a pound of cotton rises or falls sixfold. Whether it rises or falls, the spinner would add the same amount of labor time and thus the same amount of value to a given amount of cotton. Similarly, it would produce the same amount of yarn in the same amount of time. But the value that he transfers from the cotton to the yarn would be 6 times greater in the one case and only 1/6 as much in the other. The same thing would happen if the means of labor became more expensive or cheaper, yet continued to perform the same service in the labor process as before. If the technological conditions of the spinning process don't change and the value of the means of production remains constant too, then with the spinner working the same amount of time, he will consume the same quantities of raw material and machinery containing the same quantities of value. The old value that the spinner preserves in the product is, in this case, directly proportional to the new value he adds to it. He adds twice as much labor in 2 weeks as in one, thus twice as much value. At the same time, the spinner consumes twice as much material, worth twice as much, while using up twice as much of the machinery as before, also worth twice as much. Thus, he preserves in the product of 2 weeks of labor twice as much value as in the product of 1 week. If the conditions of production don't change, then the more new value a worker adds to his product, the more old value he also preserves in it. However, he doesn't preserve more old value because he is adding more new value, but simply because he is adding it under conditions that remain the same and are independent of the labor he performs. In a way, of course, a worker always preserves old value in direct proportion to the new value he adds. Whether the price of the cotton rises from 1 shilling to 2 or falls from 6 to 6 pence, when a worker works for an hour, he always transfers half as much value from the cotton as he would if he worked for 2 hours instead. If the worker's productivity changes, he will spin either more or less cotton in an hour than before, and accordingly, he will transfer either more or less value from the cotton to the product of an hour of its labor. But however his productivity varies, he will transfer twice as much value in 2 hours of labor as he would in 1 hour. Value exists only in a use value, in a thing, with the exception of the purely symbolic representation of value in tokens. The human being, regarded as the mere existence of labor power, is itself a natural object, a thing, even if it is a living thing with consciousness. And labor is the physical expression of this power. If a thing loses its use value, it will lose its value too. However, the means of production don't instantly lose their value when they lose their use value, because they lose the original shape of their use value in the labor process only in order to take on the shape of a different use value, that of the product. But while value can only exist in a use value, it doesn't matter at all which use value it exists in, as we saw when considering the metamorphosis of commodities. From this, it follows that in the labor process, value is transferred from the means of production to the product only to the extent that these means lose their exchange value when they lose their independent use value. In other words, the means of production give a new product only as much value as they themselves lose when the product is made. Here, however, the objective factors of the labor process don't all behave the same way. If the technological conditions of the spinning process don't change, and the value of the means of production remain constant too, then with the spinner working the same amount of time, he will consume the same quantities of raw material and machinery, containing the same quantities of value. The old value that the spinner preserves in the product is, in this case, directly proportional to the new value he adds to it. He adds twice as much labor in 2 weeks as in one, thus twice as much value. At the same time, the spinner consumes twice as much material, worth twice as much, while using up twice as much of the machinery as before, also worth twice as much. Thus, he preserves in the product of 2 weeks of labor twice as much value as in the product of 1 week. If the conditions of production don't change, then the more new value a worker adds to his product, the more old value he also preserves in it. However, he doesn't preserve more old value because he is adding more new value, but simply because he is adding it under conditions that remain the same and are independent of the labor he performs. In a way, of course, a worker always preserves old value in direct proportion to the new value he adds, whether the price of cotton rises from 1 shilling to 2 or falls to 6 pence. When a worker works for an hour, he always transfers half as much value from the cotton as he would if he worked for 2 hours instead. If the worker's productivity changes, he will spin either more or less cotton in an hour than before, and accordingly, he will transfer either more or less value from the cotton to the product of an hour of his labor. But however his productivity varies, he will transfer twice as much value in 2 hours as he would in 1 hour. Value exists only in a use value, with the exception of the purely symbolic of the use in tokens. Why am I repeating this? The human being, regarded as the mere existence of labor power, is itself a natural object, a thing, even if it is a living thing with consciousness, and labor is the physical expression of this power. If a thing loses its value, it loses its value too. However, the means of production don't instantly lose their value when they lose their use value because they lose the original shape of their use value in the labor process only in order to take on the shape of a different use value, that of the product. But while value can only exist in a use value, it doesn't matter at all which use value it exists in, as we saw when considering the metamorphosis of commodities. From this, it follows that in the labor process, value is transferred from the means of production to the product only to the extent that these means lose their exchange value when they lose their independent use value. In other words, the means of production give a new product only as much value as they themselves lose when the product is made. Here, however, the objective factors of the labor process don't all behave the same way. That is, the coal fed to a machine vanishes without a trace. The same is true of the oil used to grease an axle and so on. Dyes and other auxiliary materials disappear but resurface as the characteristics of the product they go into. Raw material makes up a product substance, but the raw material's form always changes. Raw materials and auxiliary materials lose the independent shapes in which they enter into the labor process as use values. Not so with the actual means of labor. Machines, factory buildings, and containers serve in the labor process only for as long as they keep their original form and can enter the process each day in the same form as the day before. And just as these things retain an independent form separate from that of the product during their lives, i.e., during the labor process, they also retain such a form after they die. The corpses of machines, tools, and factory buildings always continue to exist independently of the products they help make. Let us now consider the entire lifespan of a means of labor from the day that it enters the workshop to the day that it is tossed onto the junk pile. Its use value is used up completely during this period, and thus its entire exchange value is transferred to the product it is employed to make. If a spinning machine's lifespan is a decade, then during the 10 years it serves in the labor process, its total value is transferred to the products manufactured during that time. Thus, the life of a means of labor encompasses the labor processes, however many, that are carried out with its help again and again. Human beings and the means of labor share this fate. For every person loses 24 hours of his life every day. Furthermore, while it is impossible to know just by looking at someone exactly how many of these daily deaths he's experienced, that doesn't prevent life insurance companies from using the average human life expectancy to come up with precise and also very lucrative projections. And the same thing holds for means of labor. Experience tells us how long, on average, a given means of labor, say a particular type of machine, will last. If it takes only 6 days for its use values to be consumed in the labor process, then each day it will give an average of 1/6 of its value to the day's product. This is how we calculate the rate at which a means of labor wears out and how much value it loses daily, and the corresponding amount of value it gives each day to a new product. What should be crystal clear is that a means of production never gives more value to a product than it loses when its use value is destroyed in the labor process. If a means of production had no value to lose, if it weren't itself a product of human labor, then it wouldn't give any value to a new product. It would serve to create use values without serving to create exchange value. This is, in fact, the case with all those means of production that are found ready-made in nature, such as land, wind, water, the iron in the earth, the wood in natural forests, and so on. Here we encounter another interesting phenomenon. Let's say that a machine is worth 1,000 pounds and wears out in 1,000 days. Thus, 1,000th of the machine's value is transferred each day to the product it helps make. Meanwhile, the entire machine continues to serve in the labor process, albeit with less and less vitality. So a factor of the labor process, a means production, and enters that process as a whole, but it enters the valorization process piecemeal. The difference between the labor process and the valorization process is thus reflected in their objective factors. As an element of the labor process, a means of production contributes to the production process only in it that means entirety. But as an element of the production of the process of creating value, the same means contributes to the same production process only piecemeal. Yet a means of production can also enter the valorization process as a whole, even as it enters the labor process only piece by piece. Suppose that for every 115 pounds of cotton spun every day, 15 pounds always winds up destroyed or turned into devil's dust rather than yarn. If losing these 15 pounds of cotton is normal, if that is an unavoidable side effect of spinning the cotton, then the value of these 15 pounds of cotton goes into the yarn just as surely as the 100 pounds that make up the yarn's substance, despite the fact that the 15 pounds aren't actually part of the yarn. The use value of 15 pounds of cotton has to be turned into dust in order to produce 100 pounds of cotton. Pulverizing this cotton is therefore a condition of production that must be met because it is a necessary condition, and for that reason alone, the value of the 15 pounds is transferred to the yarn. This holds for all the unavoidable waste that labor processes produce, at least insofar as the waste can't function as new means of production and thus also as independent use values, such as the mountains of iron shavings we see in Manchester's large machine building factories. Thrown off by gargantuan leveling machines, they're carted away to the foundry in the evening, only to be brought back to the factories the next day as solid masses of iron. As the means of production operate in the shape of old use value during the labor process, they transfer value to a product's new shape of use value only to the extent that they lose value. Clearly, the means of production can lose only as much value as they have when they enter the labor process. The value they lose is limited by the labor time it took to produce them in the first place. Thus, they never contribute more value to a new product than they possess, independently of the labor process they are serving in. However useful a material of labor, a machine, or some other means of production may be, if it costs 150 pounds, say 500 days of labor, it can't give more than 150 pounds to the total product or products it is used to make. Its value is determined not by the labor process it enters into as a means of production, but rather by the labor process out of which it issued as a product. A means of production can serve in the labor process only as a use value, a thing with useful properties. It won't contribute value to a product unless it already has value before it enters that process. When productive labor transforms the means of production into the elements used to make a new product, a transmigration of souls come about. The value of these means passes from a consumed body into one that is newly formed. But this transmigration happens behind the back of the actual labor being carried out. A worker can't add new labor. In other words, he can't create new value without preserving old value, for he has to add new labor in a particular useful form, and he can't add labor in such a form without making products into a new product's means of production, and thereby transferring the value of the older products to the new product. Activated labor power, that is, living labor, naturally has the capacity to preserve value as it adds new value. This natural gift, which doesn't cost a worker a thing, is a boon for the capitalist. It preserves his existing capital value. If the capitalist business is running smoothly, he will be too focused on turning a profit to notice labor's generosity. But if the labor process is disrupted in some dramatic way, if crisis occurs, he will be painfully aware of it. The only part of a means of production that is used up is its use value. Labor makes products precisely by doing that. The value of the means of production isn't consumed, and so it can't be reproduced. Instead, this value is preserved, not because of something that is done to it during the labor process, but rather because even though the use value it exists in originally does disappear, it merely disappears into a different use value. The value of a means of production reappears in the product's value, yet isn't, strictly speaking, reproduced there. What is produced in a new use value in which the old exchange value merely reappears. Now, not so with the subjective or human component of the labor process, the activated labor power. Every instant that labor is in motion, transferring the value of the means of production to new products thanks to its purposeful form and preserving their value there, it also creates additional value, new value. Suppose a production process stops at a point where the worker produces the equivalent of the value of his own labor power. For example, where he has generated value worth 3 shillings in 6 hours of labor. These 3 shillings are the part of the product's value that doesn't come from the means of production. They are the only part actually generated during the production process, the only new part. Of course, this new value merely replaces the money that the capitalist advances when he buys the labor power, which is also money. that the worker spends on his means of subsistence. So the 3 shillings of new value appear to merely reproduce the 3 shillings that the capitalist advances. In other words, the original value. But this doesn't merely seem to be so, as is the case with the value of the means of production. The original 3 shillings really are reproduced. Here, the production of new value mediates the process whereby one value replaces another. But we already know that the labor process extends past the point where merely the equivalent of the labor power's value is reproduced and added to the object of labor. 6 hours would suffice to do that. Instead, the labor process lasts longer, say 12 hours. Thus, activated labor power doesn't only reproduce value, it also produces an excess value. This surplus value is the part of the product's value that exceeds the value of the factors consumed in the production process, namely means of production and labor power. When we describe the various roles that the different components of the labor process play in forming product value, we were in fact characterizing the various functions of capital's different components in its own valorization process. The amount by which a product's total value exceeds the combined value of the elements that went into making it is the amount by which the valorized capital exceeds the value of the capital that was originally advanced. The means of production on the one side and labor power on the other. These are merely the forms of existence that the original capital value took when it shed its money form and was transformed into the different factors of the labor process. The value of the part of capital that turns into the means of production, i.e. raw material, auxiliary material, and the means of labor, doesn't increase or decrease during the production process. I will therefore call it the constant part of capital, or more simply, constant capital. In contrast, the part of capital's value that turns into labor power does change during the production process. This part reproduces its own equivalent and produces value in excess of it, surplus value, which can also vary. Surplus value can be smaller or larger. In other words, this part of capital is continuously transformed from a constant magnitude into a variable one. I will therefore call it the variable part of capital, or more simply, variable capital. The same components of capital, from the standpoint of the labor process, differ as objective factors versus subjective ones, differ from the standpoint of the valorization process as constant capital versus variable capital. Of course, the concept of constant capital in no way implies that the value of this capital's component parts can't change. Imagine that a pound of cotton costs sixpence today, but tomorrow its price rises to 1 shilling as a result of a bad harvest. Old cotton that is still being worked on was bought for 6pence. Now, however, it adds 1 shilling of value to the product, and the cotton that has already been spun and might already be circulating in the market as yarn also adds twice its original value to the product. It is easy to see that these changes take place independently of the cotton's valorization in the actual spinning process. Old cotton that hasn't even entered the labor process can be resold for 1 shilling instead of 6pence. In fact, the fewer labor processes the cotton has gone through, the more certain this result will be. So as a rule, when such changes of value occurs, capitalists speculate on raw material in its rawest form. They would rather speculate on yarn than cloth. They would rather speculate on cotton than yarn. Here, the change of value comes about in the process that produces the cotton, not the process in which cotton functions as a means of production and thus as constant capital. A commodity's value might be determined by the amount of labor the commodity contains, but this quantity itself is socially determined. One and the same quantity of a commodity, for example, cotton, represents more value during bad harvests than during good ones. And if the amount of the social labor time it takes to produce a commodity changes, this will affect all existing commodities of the same kind. For a commodity counts for something only as an individual member of a species, and its value is always measured in terms of socially necessary labor, the labor necessary to produce it under the social conditions of the day. Just as the value of raw material can vary, so too can the value of the means of labor serving in the production process, machinery, and so on. Thus, the amount of value they contribute to the product can vary as well. Suppose that someone invents a way to produce a new machine using less labor than it took to make the old one. The old machine will be devalued to a great or lesser extent and will therefore give less value to a new product. But here too, the change of value arises outside of the production process in which a thing, in this case a machine, functions as a means of production. Within that process, as we know, a means of production never contributes more value to new products than it possesses independently of the process. A means of production remains constant capital even when the magnitude of its value changes after it has already entered the production process. Nor is the functional difference between constant capital and variable capital affected when the ratio between their magnitudes of value varies. It doesn't matter if the technological conditions of the labor process are altered so radically that a single worker using an expensive machine can now do a large quantity of material what 10 workers wielding 10 inexpensive tools used to do to an amount of raw material 100 times smaller. In such a case, the constant capital, the quantity of value contained in the means of production, would rise sharply, and the capital's variable part, advanced in the form of labor power, would fall sharply. But this change would affect only the ratio of constant capital to variable capital, i.e., the ratio between the constant capitals and the variable capital's respective shares of the total capital. The essential difference between constant and variable capital would remain unaltered. The end of the chapter. Endnote 1. Labor gives a new creation for one extinguished. Endnote 2. At issue here aren't the repairs that the means of labor, machines, and buildings require. A machine that is being repaired functions as the material of labor rather than a means a means of it. One doesn't work with such a machine, one works on it to restore its use value. For our purposes, this labor of repairing can always be treated as part of the labor that goes into producing a means of labor. In the body of this text, however, we have dealt with the kind of wear that no doctor can cure and gradually leads to death. That kind of wear, which cannot be repaired from time to time, and which, in the case of a knife, would ultimately reduce it to a state in which the cutler would say of it, "It is not worth a new blade." As we saw there, it is, as a whole, that a machine enters every single labor process, but it is only piecemeal that the same machine enters the process of valorization taking place concurrently. If we keep this in mind, we can appreciate the following conceptual confusion. Mr. Ricardo speaks of the portion of labor of the engineer in making stocking machines, as contained, for example, in the value of a pair of stockings. Yet the total labor that produced each single pair of stockings includes the whole labor of the engineer, not a portion. For one machine makes many pairs, and none of those pairs would have been done without any part of the machine. The author, an uncommonly smug wiseacre, is justified in his confusion, and thus in his polemic, and so far as Ricardo and all other political economists, both before him and after him, have failed to distinguish precisely between the two sides of labor, and therefore done even less to analyze their different roles in creating value. From this is endnote 3. From this, we gain a sense of the insipid J.B. Say's absurdity. Say wanted to derive surplus value, that is, interest, profit, and rent, from the services productifs supplied in the labor process by the use value of various means of production, land, instruments of labor, leather, and so on. Not one to let the clever apologetic ideas that pop into his head go unpunished, Wilhelm Roscher explained, J.B. Say correctly remarks that the value an oil well produces after all costs have been subtracted is something new, something fundamentally different from the labor that made the well. Quite right. The oil produced by the well is something very different from the labor required to build the well. And under value, Mr. Rocher understands such things as oil because oil has value, although petroleum can be found ready-made in nature, if also in relatively small quantities, which is what he seems to have in mind when he remarks, it, that is nature, hardly ever produces exchange value. Here, Mr. Rocher's that nature and the exchange value it yields are like the foolish virgin who confesses that she has a child, but only a very small one. This same scholar also uses the occasion mentioned above to say Ricardo's school tends to subsume capital as accumulated labor under the heading of labor. This is inept because the owner of the capital has done more than simply create and preserve the same, namely, what? He has refrained from using it for his own pleasure, demanding a return interest, for example. This anatomical physiological method of political economy, which takes a mere demand and explicates it into value, is so very deft. Of all the instruments of the farmer's trade, the labor of man is that on which he is most to rely for the repayment of his capital. The other two, the working stock of the capital and the carts, plows, spades, and so forth, without a given portion of the first, are nothing at all. Edmund Burke. And note 5. The 26th November 1862 issue of the Times printed the whinings of a cotton manufacturer whose mill employed 800 workers while consuming on average 150 bales of East Indian cotton per week or 130 bales of American cotton. He wanted to publicly complain about what he had to pay in overhead expenses even when his factory wasn't in use. These he estimated to £6,000 annually. Many of the expenses factored in don't concern us here: rent, taxes, insurance premiums, salaries for employees who are paid by the year, such as the manager, bookkeeper, engineer, and so on. But the owner also included £150 worth of coal used to warm the mill occasionally and start the steam engine. In addition, he listed the wages of the workers employed now and then to keep the machines in working order, and finally, £1,200 for the wear and tear suffered by the machine, since the weather and the natural principle of decay do not suspend their operations because the steam engine ceases to revolve. He expressly stated that he gave such a low sum, just £1,200, because his machines had already deteriorated a great deal. And note 6, productive consumption, where the consumption of a commodity is part of the process of production. In these cases, there is no consumption of value. Number 7, and note, in a North American compendium that has gone through perhaps 20 editions, we read, quote, "It matters not in what form capital reappears," unquote. After garrulously enumerating every possible ingredient of production whose value reappears in the product, the book finally states, quote, "The various kinds of food, clothing, and shelter necessary for the existence and comfort of the human being are also changed. They are consumed from time to time, and their value reappears in that new vigor imparted to his body and mind, forming fresh capital to be employed again in the work of production," unquote. Setting aside all other oddities, it isn't the price of bread that reappears in a worker's renewed power, but rather its nourishing substances. In contrast, what reappears in the value of this power isn't his means of subsistence, but rather their value. The same means of subsistence, even if they cost half as much, would produce just as much muscle, bone, and so on. In other words, the same amount of power, but not power of the same value. This converting of value into power, and also the author's quite pharisaic lack of clarity, obscure a futile attempt to spin surplus value out of the mere reappearance of the value advanced. And number 8, all products of the same type properly form but one single mass, the price of which is determined in general and with regard and without regard to particular circumstances. And fortunately, the editor's notes give us only one, Roman numeral 1. The phrase devil's dust was sometimes used interchangeably with the term shoddy, since the machine that ground old rags and scraps of fabric into shoddy was known as the devil. But Marx is clearly pointing to a different meaning where devil's dust signifies the unusable bits of cotton thrown off when cotton is spun into yarn. That's the end of chapter 6, constant capital and variable capital, in Marx's volume 1 of chapter 6 of Capital, the Princeton edition 2024. Now, let me make some brief comments and then I'll stop, thankfully. The point, of course, here, and it does seem a kind of, sort of after the fact rationalization of how value gets transmigrates, as he says, or transforms. And there's an entire literature that, addresses this problematic relation. And I've commented on this before. And it gets more complicated once you start thinking of labor employed in, for example, departments, and whether there is a difference between unproductive and productive labor. And these distinctions get more complicated when we think about departments. That is, a department 1, which is about production, and a department 2, which is about distribution or consumption, in that particular sense, the consumption of certain items, elements of production. Now, the whole issue here, of course, is problematic, and even more problematic when we compare constant capital and variable capital in Capital Volume 1 and fixed capital and circulating capital in Volume 2. Note that, and yes, this is a Gemini a description of the difference between constant and variable capital and fixed and circulating capital. And it is complicated in the sense that things that are fixed are perhaps the same thing that could be seen also as constant. So what's the diff, as they say? The differences of certain elements, including time, duration as an element of time, and specific things. Certain things don't, some things are fixed, but yet aren't constant, for example, like land. And so these are the differences that we could say. There is, of course, machinery and wages and a bunch of other stuff. You can read that. The point I made, and I put it into a table, is the difference can be shown in columns 2 and 3, and 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and 4 and 5. That is constant capital, variable capital compared here, and fixed capital and circulating capital labeled here. It depends on perspective, I think, which is important. And there is a certain type, that is, there's labor versus non-labor, but also the idea that some things last longer than others. Fixed capital lasts longer than circulating capital. The perspective, of course, here is that constant capital and variable capital are things that create value, the big V value. Fixed capital and circulating capital are a description that is more secondary in the sense that it talks about the cycles or the circuits in which these elements are put into place. So they're of a particular difference in perspective. And Marx talks about transferring value. So he talks about constant capital, existing value transferred to the final product. Variable capital is the new value that's created as capital. Now, the difference for fixed capital and circulating capital is, as we looked at in terms of cycles, value gradually transferred over lifespan, and the entire value transferred in one cycle. So in other words, there, as I've mentioned before, and to describe how Marx describes it in further volumes, is that there are overlapping cycles of circulation, circuits of capital, and that for the smaller scale, the short-term assets that have a shorter durability and use cycle, the value gets transferred in one cycle and moves to another cycle. Whereas for fixed capital, it moves, quote unquote, slower. Now, the examples that Marx uses are raw material, machinery, and buildings for constant capital. and variable capital is wages. So you can see that there is some transformation here. This is that relation to labor power assessed as wages. So you can see the difference between constant capital and variable capital in columns 2 and 3. And columns 4 and 5, wages still appear as circulating capital, as do raw material in this particular case as a short-term thing, but the fixed capital lasts a little longer, machinery and buildings, similarly over here in column 2. Now, it's just a matter of space and time in that sense, but it is important enough, for example, for David Harvey to be very concerned about what counts as these things that are in motion. And of course, people have fixated on these things in subsequent interpretations of Marx and have come to their own conclusions. And even Andy Higginbottom here talks about capital less about these slight distinctions, but these are all differences. That is, in the original table here, you can see that there's a difference at work here, small differences, but differences nonetheless. And it is the system of differences, I think, that is important. Ultimately, that will be how we describe capital it, as abstract labor, but abstracted so far that, it is not sinew and bones. It's something else. And it's not necessarily all knowledge or skill, but it is sort of a system of capital that engages a variety of integrated elements. And so, in effect, and with all due respect, it is a metamorphosis. It is a kind of transformation in that particular sense. And you can see that Higginbottom here describes it in further detail from volume 1, that is our volume 1 description of the differences between absolute surplus value and relative surplus value, no different in the sense than we've just discussed with fixed and flexible. And circulation of capital in volume 2, its appearance as opposed to essence. And finally, the actuality of it. And in all of this, we have systems of transformation that is difference here. On the one hand, they're common, that is, they're common in certain variables, that is, or certain results, that is, wage labor, a certain metamorphosis, the commodity, the ultimate form in terms of completion, the front end of the logical chain, the product of labor versus the product of capital. There's a contradiction there. And we can see this expressed in difference. And there is a systemic contradiction, not a systemic unity, as Higginbottom identifies. And this idea, this dialectical idea, is further explained by certain things that are problematic. That is, whether the laws of motion of capital fully realize themselves as falling rates of profit. There are clearly crises. There clearly is historical destiny, but the falling rate of profit is another, problematic element. Now, that's a way in which modern scholars have tried to approach this sort of question, and it all, sums up as the totalized as the value of a commodity. Now, explaining surplus value, that we'll talk about that subsequently. But the issue here is problems of necessary value versus surplus value, and ultimately explaining all of this as a function of a methodology that Marx has committed to in the labor theory of value, which Steve Keen has said, well, he's trying to stick with Ricardo's labor theory of value. And there is a moment at which you can't totally buy into that. And Marx provides us at least with a framework from which we can operate, but in which we cannot be totally determinative. And Steve Keen describes this, and I'm almost to the end. The idea is that Steve Keen describes this in an article from 1993. Uh, I think in the simplest way possible, as if it couldn't be. Use value, exchange value, and the demise of Marx's labor theory of value of 1993, in the Journal of the History of Economic Thought. Steve Keen, who has done a book on debunking economics and a variety of other things, and has challenged Nordhaus on the Nobel Prize winner on his estimation of what counts as um, pollution and the whole issue of framing the relation of technology to climate change. Um, the point here, specifically in this article, is to describe the differences between two schools of thought, as it were. Those who regard the labor theory of value as an indivisible component of Marxism, and those who wish to continue the spirit of analysis begun by Marx without the labor theory of value. And this whole moment of uh, what some people, on one hand, in one school, would say is the jettisoning the essence of Marxism, becomes highly problematic. The point, is not that and by that movement, negate or dissolve or eliminate the use of a labor theory of value. And of course, some people take that literally. That is, that it's an attack on the whole organization of the labor process, et cetera, as though it were anti-working class and et cetera, which is, giving it short shrift. I mean, history has occurred, and uh, there the whole issue of questions of class, et cetera, are still not part of that problem. I mean, it doesn't all dissolve down to a labor or devolve to a labor theory of value. That doesn't discredit the Marxist enterprise. The Marxist enterprise is a critique of society as well as of political economy. And the point is, of course, is political and social and economic change, and not the question of whether it is or isn't predicated on a particular theory of value, because it is, after all, a theory. In this debate between these two camps, the former has attempted to draw support from Marx's concepts of value, while the latter has ignored them, taking instead as their starting point the truism that production generates a surplus. However, a careful examination of the development of Marx's logic points out a profound irony. That after a chance rereading of Hegel, Marx made a crucial advance, which should have led him to replace the labor theory of value with a theory that commodities in general are the source of surplus. And, why else begin Capital, Volume 1, with commodities? Marx's value analysis is thus consistent, not with those who would defend the labor theory of value, but with those who would transcend it. So now the point is it negating it? And that's a whole nother kind of set of dialectic questions. But I think it's really worthwhile to consider that, history has happened, time has passed, it's the 21st century, and we need to sort of see this in context. However, Marx did not properly apply this analysis to non-labor inputs, while the cornerstone of Capital was the correct application of the same analysis to labor. Recall, of course, that Capital is meant as sort of a technical manual for those who have read the Communist Manifesto, are interested in, well, why does this happen? How does this happen? And Marx is trying to provide a means by which you can explain how exploitation occurs. But remember, it still starts with the commodity form. This unjustified asymmetrical treatment of the labor and non-labor inputs to production is therefore the true and unsound foundation of Marx's labor theory of value. And with it corrected, when you correct it, the labor theory of value collapses. Now, people have sort of stopped there and said, well, there you go, that there's no Marxism, whatever. And without, because I'm going to run out of time, Um, the point is, and without sort of rehearsing the entire argument, but the issue is that it's not simply about, and in fact, you can see even in the reading that you're trying to go, well, what's getting transferred, what thing, and there's a sort of reifying that goes on. um it is more than that, and it is the coping with certain elements that Marx doesn't fully explicate, especially in volume one. um and he doesn't quite get to it in volumes two and three, but I think he implies it, and provides at least the basis for which we get this sort of transcendent, as it were, the new interpretation literature, which doesn't negate the issue that laborers are involved, etc., but it is a different way in which to talk about the question of um, things like depreciation, which is described in Marx's original the original chapter, as we were talking above, but not fully explicated. And it's not simply about an accounting measure, but it is the problem of creating value. And I think that that's um, um, that's taking or transcending the particular moment or discussion that Marx introduces in volume one, that there is a equivalence relative to the value lost by the machine and the value added. And this equivalence argument actually creates the problem. So one has to sort of say, okay, it is not a question of, it's better. What needs to be done is to better understand the question of how value is added. And you can argue, from a Marxian point of view, Marxist dialectics provides the axiomatic basis on which to discern between value added and depreciation, and thus reject the identification of value creating capacity with value lost. Um, and because it's kind of hard to estimate those kinds of things, but yet they are there. Certainly, accounting measures are deployed to kind of do that. Um, because it gets you into sort of logical fallacies about, well, how did you do that? So the amount lost in depreciation was significantly less than the amount it contributes to the value of output, and it will, with labor, be a source of surplus value. The the point being is that you can still get the surplus value, um, you know, uh, in his algebraic and numerical explorations of value creation, all those numbers and tables, Marx compounded his previous logical errors by using the same magnitude for the exchange value and the use value of the means of production, while using different magnitudes for the exchange value and use value of labor power. And this is the key to the whole point here, is that uh, getting these things to work out and trying to use relatively simple math to get to that is part of the problem. And Marx knew this. It's why he was doing calculus, why he was making extensive notes on calculus in the later period. So there is a literature on Marx's math that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It just shows that Marx was concerned about these issues. Um, and so anyway, the point is that we can see that there's uh, Marx's reliance on Ricardo in some ways gets him into trouble. And I think you can. This is Steve Keen's table, where labor power is involved and commodity inputs are involved, and there's a question of consistency about whether uh, what it is, that is exchange value, what use value is in reference to that. How is a labor power different from the commodity inputs? And that's another question. And so that it is problematic about trying to keep these things all together. So you have to argue that the quantified use value of the means of production is the same as the quantified exchange value, is to argue that in the case of the means of production, exchange value and use value are identical. And it's sort of the key to the argument between Heinrich and Moseley to ask certain questions about what counts as exchange value in all of this, whether it is or it isn't there, or it's just shifting that value question about what's being added and what's being subtracted to a different level. The question is, if you do that, you accept certain ideas that go to the utility analysis, which is where a lot of ink got spilled. So the point is, the conclusion that labor cannot be the only source of value has long ceased to be novel. Now I'm going to stop right now because we're on to Star Trek, and I apologize for running over time, but the whole point is, and you can see this in the literature, that we'll get back to this tomorrow. We'll try and explain our way out of this tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Anne.